Right, wide blade versus narrow blade. Let's take a look at the both of them. Camping tools, I want to discuss the differences between a wide blade and a more narrow bladed knife, and the pros and cons of those. Really, when it comes to a wide bladed knife, and that's when we think of wide bladed knives, we might think of things like kitchen knives or even cleavers. You know, cleavers can be at least have this kind of depth of the blade. And the reason, or some of the pros for a wide bladed knife is being able to cut effectively through very thick things. Okay, and so you may have seen me in the past using a wide bladed knife to cut through a quite a large catfish. You know, so maybe the catfish was 3/4 of the diameter of this trunk almost. And the thing is, once the blade gets up to gets well into it in the cutting, you can place your palm of your hand and put pressure on the blade to help force it through. And if it's really thick, you know, that's going to really aid things. Now, on the other hand, if the blade is a more narrow blade, such as this is a more traditional sort of blade depth here. Once it gets through here, if the object you're trying to push cut into is deeper than that, well, you put your palm on your hand on there, it's going to be stopped by whatever you're trying to push through, and that's it. And then you can only cut through the rest of the material by the force you apply on the handle. That's an advantage of having a wider bladed knife. You know, you've just got this depth more to, you know, apply to cut through whatever thick object you're trying to cut through. And that can be something like big fish, where you're trying to make cutlets of the fish, something like that. My take on this is that the wider bladed knife, this looks more like of a tool here compared to a traditional knife style. Yeah, is that the wider bladed knife can be more versatile, depending, of course, on the tasks that are at hand. You know, if you're not cutting through big fish, well, that's just not an issue. Okay, and as long as the knife is sharp and the handle is comfortable, you can still push through. But this really has an advantage, the deeper blade, because you can push that through and you've got this much more blade. You know, let's just compare the thicknesses here. If we can, you've got another 1.5 centimeters almost of blade depth. Well, you see this one's got a really good tip on it. So for gutting fish, again, I came back to fish because, you know, it's an integral part of being in the outdoors, fishing and stuff. With a good tip, it's easy to insert through the vent and gut the fish. However, it doesn't really have a tip on it at all. So in order to gut the fish, you have to use a slightly different technique if you're going to use this knife. That's not from the tip, because the tip's really fat. And that is to use this part here of the Western Tanto on here. And this has to be kept sharp here. And this is, if this is really sharp, this is enough to penetrate the vent and start the cut. So you don't go from here, you go from here on a Tanto, unless it's a really sharp pointed Tanto, of course. Now, as far as going as cutting, you know, things that are not so large in diameter, take for instance this fat, this salted fat, very unhealthy but very delicious, full of energy. It doesn't make any difference really whether you've got a blade this wide or this wide. And of course, you've all seen fish knives, they're really, really thin. That will still cut through this thing as well too. It won't make any difference. Let's cut some of this off. It's really delicious stuff, full of energy out in the wild. So it's easily cut with that knife, just as easily as it is cut with this knife. Okay, it's just delicious regardless of which knife it's cut with.